In the year 850, a group of Chinese alchemists were not trying to build a weapon. They were trying to live forever. Mixing sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal in search of an elixir of immortality, they stumbled onto the deadliest invention of the pre-modern world entirely by accident. Within 6 centuries, that same accidental mixture would breach walls that had stood for over 1,000 years, launch an age of global exploration, arm the ships that crossed the Atlantic, and eventually split into 2 separate chemistries. One feeds nearly half the people on Earth today. The other has killed millions of them. This is the history of gunpowder, and it starts with a search for eternal life. The alchemists were Taoist monks working under the Tang Dynasty, and their goal was not violence, it was longevity. Chinese court physicians and mystics had spent centuries experimenting with mineral compounds they believed could extend the human lifespan, sometimes fatally. Several Tang emperors, including Emperor Xianzong and Emperor Wuzong, are recorded to have died from mercury-based elixirs their own alchemists prepared for them, poisoned slowly in the pursuit of eternal life. Saltpeter, a white mineral crystal found in caves and old cellar walls, was one of dozens of substances these alchemists experimented with, prized for its unusual property of making flames burn a strange violet color. Somewhere around the middle of the 9th century, a monk mixing sulfur and saltpeter with honey and charcoal recorded that the mixture flared, singed his hands and face, and burned down the building he was working in. A Taoist text from the period, the Zhenyuan Miaodao Yaolui, warned other alchemists explicitly against combining these ingredients, describing smoke and flames rising to the alchemist's own detriment. They had not found immortality. They had found something else entirely, and they gave it a name that still carries the irony today: Huo Yao, fire medicine. For a while, fire medicine stayed a curiosity of monasteries and court physicians. That changed once Chinese military engineers realized what it could do to an enemy. By the year 904, during the chaotic final decades of the Tang Dynasty, Chinese forces were using primitive gunpowder-based flying fire to set siege engines ablaze at the siege of Yuzhang. Within a century, that experimentation had produced fire lances, bamboo or metal tubes packed with gunpowder that shot flame and shrapnel at an approaching enemy, and fire arrows tipped with burning gunpowder charges. In 1044, the Song Dynasty published the Wujing Zongyao, the complete essentials from the military classics, and buried inside its pages were the earliest written gunpowder formulas in world history. 3 separate recipes tuned for incendiary bombs, thrown grenades, and choking smoke. For the next 2 centuries, gunpowder lived a double life in China. In its ceremonial form, it lit up imperial festivals as fireworks, a use so central to Chinese culture that firecrackers are still set off today for the same reason they were 1,000 years ago, to frighten away evil spirits. In its military form, it spread west along the same trade networks that carried silk and spices, carried this time not by merchants but by conquest. When the Mongol armies swept through Song China in the 1200s, they absorbed Chinese gunpowder technology, along with the engineers who knew how to build and operate it, and carried both with them as they rolled across Central Asia and into the Middle East, deploying gunpowder weapons at sieges from Baghdad in 1258 to Aleppo and beyond. Arabic military texts from the period describe saltpeter using a telling nickname, Chinese snow. By 1267, an English friar named Roger Bacon had gotten hold of a version of the formula and recorded it in his Opus Majus, deliberately scrambled into an anagram, as if the recipe itself were too dangerous to write in plain language. Europe's earliest canons appear in manuscripts a few decades later, crude iron vessels nicknamed pots de fer, firing arrows and stone rather than the standardized cannonballs that came later. A manuscript from 1326, produced for an English royal official, shows one of the earliest known illustrations of such a weapon. A vase-shaped iron pot lying on its side, firing a single oversized arrow at a fortified door. For the first 100 years or so after gunpowder reached European hands, it was treated less like a weapon of war and more like a dark art. Common soldiers associated the acrid smoke and thunderous noise with witchcraft, and chroniclers of the period described early cannon fire in the same breath as demons and hellfire. Casting a working cannon required specialized founders, often the same craftsmen who cast church bells, who guarded their techniques as closely as any alchemist had ever guarded a formula, and kings who managed to hire one treated the resulting weapon as a status symbol nearly as much as a military asset. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English forces deployed a small handful of primitive cannons against the French, more for psychological shock than any real killing power. It took the better part of a century for European monarchs to fully grasp that this smoky, unreliable, faintly demonic mixture from the other side of the world was about to make every stone castle on the continent obsolete. But there was a problem, and it very nearly strangled gunpowder in its cradle. Early gunpowder, known as serpentine powder, was simply the three ingredients ground together into a loose black dust. The trouble was that saltpeter, the heaviest of the three components, settled to the bottom during transport, while the lighter charcoal and sulfur rode on top. A batch of powder that ignited perfectly at the foundry could arrive at a battlefield weeks later, separated into useless layers. And even when it hadn't separated, the fine dust fouled barrels and produced so much smoke that a second volley was often impossible until the air cleared. The fix, a process called corning, arrived sometime in the 1400s, wetting the mixture into a paste, forming it into hard grains and drying it evenly so it burned consistently every time. Corning solved gunpowder's reliability problem. It also created an entirely new one, because reliable gunpowder now meant one thing above all else: a dependable, massive, continuous supply of saltpeter. That single ingredient, potassium nitrate, made up roughly 75% of gunpowder by weight, and it was by far the hardest of the three to produce at scale. Europe's domestic saltpeter came from scraping the walls of stables, cellars, and dovecotes. A slow and pitiful trickle compared to what a standing army now required. Some European governments actually employed official saltpeter men, with the legal right to dig up the floors of private homes and barns in search of nitrate-rich soil, a practice so widely hated in England that it was eventually restricted by royal decree. India solved the problem for the entire world. The soil, climate, and cattle farming traditions of Bihar and Bengal produced saltpeter more efficiently and more cheaply than anywhere else on Earth, and by the 1600s, the region had become the planet's dominant source, exporting thousands of tons a year to arm the wars of nations most of its laborers would never see. The British East India Company, founded originally to trade spices and textiles, moved aggressively into the saltpeter business. And by the 1700s, it held something close to a monopoly on Bengal's nitrate exports, at times accounting for the overwhelming majority of the gunpowder ingredient reaching British ports. The company used the profits, alongside revenue from opium and cotton, to fund a private army that would eventually rival the militaries of entire European nations. In 1757, that army, led by Robert Clive and backed by bribery as much as gunpowder, defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey, with a force barely a fraction the size of his opponents. The company didn't just win a battle. It annexed the very region that had been supplying the raw material for its own weapons, a closed loop of extraction that would define the next 2 centuries of colonial rule. Behind that saltpeter monopoly sat one of the ugliest production processes in the history of any commodity. Saltpeter came from niter beds, shallow pits packed with composted cattle dung, urine, ash, and decaying organic waste, left to ferment in the heat for months while bacteria slowly converted the nitrogen inside into crystallized potassium nitrate. Laborers, drawn almost entirely from the lowest and most marginalized castes and known locally as noniyas, worked these pits by hand in stifling heat, breathing ammonia fumes strong enough to sting the eyes and throat, wading barefoot through the fermenting waste to scrape crystals from the surface for wages that barely covered subsistence. European travelers of the period reportedly wrote about smelling entire knitted districts from miles away before they ever saw them. Half a world away, the industrialized end of the same supply chain had its own body count. When the DuPont family built their black powder mills along Brandywine Creek in Delaware starting in 1802, they designed the buildings with thick stone walls on 3 sides and deliberately flimsy roofs. An engineering choice that assumed the mills would eventually explode and simply tried to direct the blast upward instead of sideways into the next building. Workers, some barely into their teens, were killed in these explosions with grim regularity, sometimes several times in a single year. And the sound of a mill blowing up along the Brandywine became so routine to nearby residents that locals could reportedly identify which specific mill had gone up just from the pitch of the blast. It was an accepted operating cost baked directly into the architecture. By the middle of the 1800s, the scale of what gunpowder had built was staggering. The East India Company's private army had grown to roughly 260,000 men, nearly twice the size of Britain's own standing army. A joint stock trading corporation, originally chartered to import pepper and silk, had become the effective government of a subcontinent home to more than 100 million people, and a meaningful share of the gunpowder that made this possible had been dug, fermented, and refined out of the very soil the company now ruled. The human toll stretched far beyond India. Across the Atlantic, the technological gap gunpowder created between European colonizers and indigenous nations in the Americas hastened a conquest whose true death toll came mostly from disease, but was enforced, expanded, and defended at gunpoint for the following 3 centuries. In West Africa, gunpowder rewired an entire continent's internal politics. At the height of the transatlantic slave trade in the 1700s, historians estimate that several 100,000 European firearms flowed into West African ports every year, arriving alongside gunpowder shipped by the barrel specifically to keep those weapons firing, and kingdoms that acquired them gained a decisive military edge over neighbors who hadn't. Over the roughly 4 centuries of the trade, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships bound for the Americas, with an estimated 2 million more dying during the Atlantic crossing itself. A horror gunpowder didn't invent, but one it dramatically industrialized and accelerated by turning the capture of human beings into an arms race with no natural stopping point. Historians have a name for the political order gunpowder built across 3 continents: the Gunpowder Empires. The Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals each organized their entire military and political structure around monopolizing the casting of cannon and the manufacture of firearms. Gunpowder did not simply help these empires expand, it decided which states got to survive at all. The ones that mastered cannon founding endured for centuries. The Byzantine Empire, which could not, did not. There is a bitter irony sitting at the center of this story, and it belongs to China. The nation that invented gunpowder 9 centuries earlier had, by the 1800s, fallen dangerously behind Europe in weapons engineering. When the First Opium War broke out in 1839, British gunboats armed with vastly superior gunpowder weaponry shelled Qing fortifications along China's own coastline and forced the empire into a catastrophically one-sided peace. The birthplace of fire medicine was pried open at gunpoint by the very invention it had given the rest of the world. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. Here is the domino chain that almost nobody connects back to a Chinese monastery. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople, a city protected by the Theodosian land walls. fortifications that had stood for over 1,000 years and repelled every army that had ever tried them. Mehmed's secret weapon was a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his cannon casting skills to the Byzantine emperor and been turned away because Constantinople couldn't afford him. Orban took his designs to the Ottomans instead and built a bronze cannon, reportedly 27 feet long, capable of firing stone balls weighing over half a ton. On May 29, 1453, that cannon and its sister guns finally did what 1,000 years of armies could not. They breached the walls, and the Byzantine Empire ended in a single afternoon. The Ottomans now controlled the overland trade routes linking Europe to the spices and silk of Asia, and they were not inclined to make that trade cheap for their rivals. European monarchies, suddenly cut off from affordable land access to Asian goods, poured money into finding a sea route instead. Portugal pushed down the African coast. Spain funded a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who set sail in 1492 looking for a western route to Asia and ran into an entire hemisphere nobody in Europe knew existed. A monk's accident in a Chinese workshop had, 6 centuries later, put a cannon in front of Constantinople's walls, and that cannon put a Spanish flag on a Caribbean beach. The same chain reaction logic played out again and again along the West African coast, this time as a self-perpetuating loop rather than a single event. The Kingdom of Dahomey, under rulers like King Agaja in the early 1700s and later King Gezo, built its power almost entirely on European muskets, arming even its famous corps of female palace guards, later nicknamed the Dahomey Amazons by European observers, with firearms decades before most European armies fully trusted women anywhere near a battlefield. Once one kingdom had guns, its neighbors needed guns simply to survive. And the only way to get them in a region where European traders accepted almost nothing else at scale was to trade captives for weapons. Those weapons were then used to raid other villages for more captives, who were traded for more weapons, in a loop with no natural exit ramp. Coastal kingdoms like Dahomey and Asante grew wealthy and militarily dominant almost entirely on the back of this trade, while inland communities that couldn't access the coast and therefore couldn't access guns became the raided rather than the raiders. The cycle fed itself for roughly 3 centuries, not because any single kingdom wanted endless war, but because gunpowder had made peace a losing strategy. As the 1800s progressed, gunpowder stopped being a specialized military secret and became industrial infrastructure. American Civil War armies burned through gunpowder by the trainload, with the Union's own powder works at a single facility in Delaware producing well over £1 million a month by the war's later years. And mining and railroad companies discovered that the same chemistry tearing men apart on battlefields could also tear through mountains. In 1867, a Swedish chemist named Alfred Nobel patented dynamite, a nitroglycerin-based explosive far more stable and far more powerful than traditional black powder, after years of dangerous experimentation that had already killed his younger brother Emil in a nitroglycerin explosion at the family's factory. Nobel marketed the new compound primarily for tunneling, mining, and canal construction, and demand was immediate and enormous. Within 2 decades, Nobel controlled roughly 90 factories spread across more than 20 countries, and dynamite became the invisible tool behind railroads, dams, and mountain passes across the industrializing world, even as the same chemistry armed the artillery of every major power in Europe. By the 20th century, the numbers involved had become almost incomprehensible. During the 4 years of the First World War, combatant nations fired well over 1 billion artillery shells combined, each one requiring its own charge of propellant, and explosives manufacturing became one of the largest industrial sectors on the planet. A position the global munitions industry, worth tens of billions of dollars today, has never really relinquished. Now here is the part of Alfred Nobel's story that even people who recognize his name rarely learn. In 1888, Nobel's brother Ludwig died in France, and a French newspaper, confusing the two brothers, mistakenly published Alfred's obituary instead. The headline branded him a merchant of death. And the text condemned a man who had become rich by finding new ways to kill people faster than ever before. Nobel was, by all accounts, horrified to see how history intended to remember him. In 1895, he quietly rewrote his will, directing the bulk of his explosives fortune into an endowment for 5 annual prizes, one of them explicitly for peace. When he died the following year, his own family reportedly contested the will, stunned that so much of the dynamite fortune was leaving the family entirely. It is the same playbook that tobacco companies and oil companies would run decades later. Fund enough visible good, and the world will remember the philanthropy instead of the product. The irony has never fully gone away. Critics have pointed out for well over a century that the world's most prestigious peace prize is funded entirely by profits from an explosives empire, and that Nobel's fortune wasn't limited to mining dynamite either, since his companies also manufactured artillery and weapons through ventures like the Swedish arms maker Bofors. Some laureates have used their own acceptance speeches to note the contradiction out loud. The Nobel Peace Prize, in other words, is not a clean break from gunpowder's bloody supply chain. It is one of that supply chain's most successful public relations campaigns. While Nobel was busy laundering a dynamite fortune into a peace prize, a German chemist named Fritz Haber was quietly solving the exact bottleneck that had shaped gunpowder's entire history since the 1400s, the saltpeter supply problem. Between 1909 and 1913, Haber, working with the industrial engineer Carl Bosch at the chemical company BASF, developed a process to synthesize ammonia directly from nitrogen in the ordinary air around us, using extreme heat and pressure to force nitrogen and hydrogen molecules to bond in a way nature rarely allows outside of lightning strikes and certain soil bacteria. It permanently ended the world's dependence on niter beds and Chilean nitrate mines in one stroke. Mines that had themselves been fought over in a brutal war a few decades earlier. A story with its own trail of bird droppings, buried empires, and cover-ups that deserves its own video. And there is one waiting for you in the corner of this screen right now. When the First World War broke out barely a year later and the Allied naval blockade cut Germany off from its Chilean nitrate imports almost overnight, the Haber-Bosch process let German factories keep manufacturing explosives anyway, and most historians agree it extended the war by years, at a cost measured in millions of additional lives on both sides of the trenches. Haber didn't stop there. He personally oversaw Germany's first large-scale chemical weapons attack, the release of chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in April of 1915, standing at the front line himself to direct the release, and earning him a second, far darker title, the father of chemical warfare. His own wife, a chemist herself, was so horrified by his work that she took her own life with his service revolver days after the Ypres attack. Researchers at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute he once ran went on to help develop the pesticide chemistry that was later refined into Zyklon B. And when the Nazis stripped Haber of his position in 1933 for being Jewish, he fled the country he had once armed and died in exile within the year, while members of his own extended family were later killed in the camps by a gas descended from his own institute's research. Here is the detail that makes this story impossible to close. The Haber-Bosch process never stopped running, and it never became purely destructive either. Researchers estimate that ammonia synthesized this way now supplies the nitrogen behind roughly half of the protein in the average human body on Earth, folded into fertilizer that feeds billions of people who will never hear Fritz Haber's name. And the compound at the center of it all, ammonium nitrate, still lives a double life as both fertilizer and explosive. It is the same chemical that powered the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the Texas City disaster in 1947, and the Beirut port explosion in 2020, one of the largest non-nuclear blasts in recorded history, caused by roughly 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate that had been sitting improperly stored in a warehouse for 6 years. Globally, The Haber-Bosch process now fixes more than 150 million tons of nitrogen every single year, an industrial output that dwarfs anything the saltpeter trade of 18th century Bengal could ever have produced. The global munitions and explosives industry, meanwhile, remains a multi-billion-dollar business in its own right. A substantial share of it still flowing, one way or another, back into the same basic chemistry a group of monks accidentally discovered in a search for immortality. The same base chemistry sits underneath a fertilizer bag in a farm supply store and a shell casing in a military depot, separated only by concentration, purity, and intent. In the years since Beirut, governments around the world have moved slowly and unevenly to tighten storage and handling rules for ammonium nitrate, though enforcement gaps remain common in exactly the ports and warehouses where the last disaster happened. International arms control treaties continue to try, with limited success, to slow the flow of gunpowder-descended weapons into conflict zones. And a newer generation of chemists is chasing something that would have sounded like alchemy to those 9th century Taoist monks. Green ammonia production, powered by renewable electricity instead of fossil fuels, aiming to keep feeding the world without the enormous carbon footprint the current process carries. Somewhere tonight, in a fertilizer plant humming along a river in a country most viewers could not point to on a map, machines are pulling nitrogen straight out of the air to grow next season's wheat. Somewhere else, in a munitions factory built on the exact same chemistry, the same reaction is being packed into shell casings instead of soil, bound for a conflict zone on the evening news. And somewhere in a city square, a firework built on a version of the original 9th century formula is being lit for a festival, drawing the same gasps of delight a Tang Dynasty audience felt over 1,000 years ago. The same flash and thunder a group of monks stumbled into while trying to live forever. They never found their elixir. They found something else instead, a chemistry that could feed the world or end it depending entirely on who was holding it, and 11 centuries later, humanity still hasn't fully decided which one it wants. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things. We've got a lot more coming.